You catch us in week 2 of a 4-week series called The Good Work. And what we've been talking about in this series is, how do we do what we have been created to do? And how do we make a difference is a big idea. And we really need a perspective change, in my opinion, as we think about what is the work that we can do. For example, we don't have to go into doing the good work thinking that we, by ourselves or with a few friends, can change the whole world. That's not the point. We can be part of a movement that does that, but we need to think about what is it that our little part of this plan is. And how many have ever asked the question, maybe of a pastor, how do I know what God's will is for me? Anybody? Yeah, most of us have. And through my experience, it takes a while sometimes for that clearly signal to come through to you through the Holy Spirit. But we're going to be talking today about how do we do the good work and how do we prepare to do the good work that God has created us to do. And if you missed last week, you can go to our website, HRCLex.life. You can see all the podcasts you can see last week. Actually, you can watch all the messages we've done for the last couple of years. And early on, in the early days, we didn't have the camera, so it's audio. It's there. You can follow it there. We'll be in Nehemiah today. It's in the Old Testament. It's about halfway through the Old Testament. So we'll be in Nehemiah 2. If you don't have your phone, you have your smartphone with you, it'll be on the screen. And what we're talking about in this series as we prepare for the good work is what examples, there's many examples in the Bible, but we're going to refer to the one about a story in the Old Testament, an account in the Old Testament about a guy named Nehemiah. You may have heard that name before. And before we do this, I want to set this up by making observations. Now, by the way, I'm included in these observations, but as I look out at this service and also the one before and those listening on the podcast, is I'm guessing that for many of us, matter of fact, I would think for all of us, there is some burden, there is some injustice going on in the world or in your little community or in your environment that concerns you. Well, am I correct? There's something going on, and it's on behalf of others. Maybe it's something that a group of people are hurting. Maybe it's those who are abused, or maybe been neglected. Maybe it's for those who are less fortunate. We try to do a lot of our outreach to fulfill that. And so what I would say is when you have this feeling of injustice that maybe God has called us to do or you to do something about it, is I call this a divine burden. A divine burden. And you may recall, if you've been here for a while, we had a series called Chasing Carrots. And there we talked about a divine discomfort, the fact that God makes us uncomfortable sometimes to get our attention. Now, as we think about what God has planned for us, we think about this divine burden. Here's a thought. I want you to write this down. If you want to take notes on one side of the program, place you can do that. And here's what I think. I think the burden we bear often reveals the calling we'll embrace. God is putting those thoughts, those feelings, that burden in our minds. So many have said the burden we face, this injustice or whatever, often reveals the calling we'll embrace. Now that means that maybe you're not quite there yet, but the Holy Spirit is working in you and with you to get you to that point in God's time, of course. In other words, there's something going on that maybe compels many of us to seek to do something about it, maybe in a ministry. The ministry doesn't have to be in a church. There's a lot of outreach outside the church walls, but maybe it's there, maybe to make a difference in someone's lives. And what I know about this is when we're on the front end of doing something like that, we never know really how significant what we're about to do really is. For example, 12 years ago, I was at another church, and we were planting churches. At that time, we had 3 churches, and we're trying to do them all about 25 minutes away from each other and still building one big church. And so we're thinking and praying about where to go, and so the thought came to be in Lexington. And so we've been praying about that, praying about Lexington, and then I even looked in Midway and Walburg and all over the place. Thomasville, I looked in Asheboro, I looked all around. But I kept getting drawn back to here. As a matter of fact, a a friend of mine, Todd Varner, he's here today, he and I think Clinton Snyder both mentioned this building that was available here in Lexington. Well, when I finally went to pursue about this, is years before we started, it was sitting empty, and they only wanted $4.5 million for it. I said, thank you very much. We'll be back. But as it turns out, years later, God found a way not to pay $4.5 million. We got it for actually $1.5 million with the help of some other churches, which is incredible, right? But see, we had this vision and this of what was needed, and we felt that at that time, again, we're talking 12 years ago, 11, that there was a need in Lexington, in our opinion, for another contemporary type church model, like we have now. And so we had no idea, though, as optimistic as we were, that it was going to be as significant as this turned out to be. Now, we've been in this building for 8 years, and for the last 4 years, we've been High Rock Church of Lexington. But the significance of what has happened, just a few things to look at. In that period of time, we've had, that we know about, that people have acknowledged, 582, actually 584 salvations, because of 2 more yesterday at Hope for Humanity. How about that? Now there's your number. We've had hundreds of baptisms. We've had a lot. I met some great friends here. We've had fellowship. But the thing I'm the proudest about is all the work that we're doing, particularly now in the last couple of years, in outreach, to reach out. That's what that word means, to reach out of the doors of this building. You've heard me say many times, if it were up to me, after the service today, I'd lock the doors, not let anybody in until next Sunday, so we could be doing church out there. And the one thing that we've accomplished is the purpose we were here, and that is to share the gospel, the good news. And obviously, we've been doing that every day. We share it every single day. And you know that if you have a friend that maybe you're a little shy about telling the gospel, if you bring your friend here or your family member, they will hear a very clear gospel. So what's the gospel? The gospel is the good news. The good news is that as you know, we're all broken. We're born into a broken world. We can thank Adam and Eve for that. In chapter 3 of Genesis, you can read about it. But God is not how he intended us, and he wasn't going to leave us that way. So he sent his only son, Jesus Christ, the only perfect person to ever live on the earth, down to this earth to rescue us, actually to save us. That's where the word salvation comes from. And how did he do it? He came down, and with all the brokenness that we're all born into, Jesus said, I will take your sins away from you. I will take them upon myself. And he did that later by willingly going to a cross. And when he took those sins, this amazes me, of all the things I've done in all the years, is God looks at me right now, and he doesn't see all that. Now, I'm still a sinner, and I still sin. I can't imagine how many times I have today or will continue. But that's the salvation. We've been sharing that. And the good news is that if we believe Jesus is God's son, believe that God sent him down here, made this great exchange, we believe that he gave himself up on a cross, went into a tomb, and believe that 3 days later he walked out of the tomb. The only religious leader in the history to walk, feet print walk out of the tomb. If we believe that, then we are called what's saved. And this has been the purpose of this building. And thank you guys so much for helping. So we saw a need that we felt, and we wanted to meet that. So now the series is called The Good Work. Now today's message I called it, Do the Work, Make a Difference. Okay, now for those who weren't here or maybe don't know the history, and that's okay, let me give you a little bit of history about Nehemiah. Let's go way back in the time machine. Let's go back 2,500 years ago, back to the year 586 BC. And there was a really evil king at that time named Nebuchadnezzar. And of course, he was always tormenting the Jews at the time. And so he was very evil. He led the Babylonian people to take over and just conquer the Jewish nation, which at that time was in Judah, was in what we call Jerusalem. And so when they came in, they literally destroyed everything. I mean, they literally took down the walls. They burned down the gates. Solomon's temple had been built. They even burned that to the ground. I mean, it was devastating, not only the physical damage, but the damage that was done to the people, because, they were having, it crushed their spirit. It demoralized them beyond any realm of how it would be to think that imagine going back to your homeland and it's all gone. All right, they came back. So there's no structure, there's no job, there's no system, there's no government, there's no leadership, there's no direction. So now some of this early remnant came back to Jerusalem, but the problem was they tried to rebuild, but they couldn't. They weren't organized, they didn't have the right people, they didn't have God, well, they didn't say about that. They just didn't get it done, and they couldn't get anything going. So about 140 years after the devastation, the destruction, then enters Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah at the time served in the court of the king. And he was an ordinary guy that happened to be blessed to be in the court of the king, and his job was a cup bearer. We mentioned last week that what does a cup bearer do? He's trusted, and what the cup bearer does is he drinks the wine, tastes the wine or any liquids before the king does to make sure that he's not being poisoned, because all the kingdoms are trying to take over each other, and also maybe to taste the food. And but by the way, this guy, I say an ordinary guy, he was in the kingdom, he was in the king's court, but he wasn't a pastor, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a prophet, he wasn't even a contractor. But this guy was getting going because he had a burden that some of his fellow Jews told him about when he asked about what's going on back in the homeland. So see, I don't know who this is going to speak to, this here today or listening, but if you may not have a big fancy job or a big position or whatever, and you're just an ordinary guy or gal. That's what we all are. But what you have is a passion from God to do something that matters. And so you're qualified to do that. We don't have to be a pastor. We don't have to be a priest. We don't have to be all these things. We're just ordinary people. And that's how Nehemiah started. So as you see, if you were with us last week, you see that Nehemiah's heart was broken for the plight of his people once he heard about what was going on. So when he heard this, the first thing he did is something that we've all done. We all acknowledged that last week. When something really disturbs us, he sat down to cry. He literally sat down to cry. And so he mourned, he fasted, he was on his knees. As a matter of fact, in the book of Nehemiah, we talked last week, he prayed at least 12 times. Now, we know that over this period of time, he probably prayed hundreds, maybe thousands of times. But the book of Nehemiah mentions 12. And so he did all this, and so finally he said, someone's got to do something. And he said, it might as well be me. So with that as the background, I want to share today 4 thoughts, if you want to take notes here. And I want to be very practical about what we do in the next step. Whenever we start, we either want to find out what God has for us, or maybe we've got that feeling, what do we do next? Okay, the very first thing we're going to do is this. We need to seek God faithfully. Seek God faithfully. See, again and again and again, we see in the book of Nehemiah that before Nehemiah did anything, he was praying to his God. He was praying. He was prepared. He was seeking God with a strong faith that he had. As a matter of fact, let me give you the timeline here. This happened during he was going to see that Nehemiah heard the bad news about his homeland in a period of time, the month called Kislev. And that's a Hebrew holiday that actually goes from our current calendar for November, December-ish. It's Kislev. Now, he prayed until the month of Nisan. Kind of interesting. That's why they got the name of the car, Nisan. And if you don't think I got 5 jokes about Nisan, then you haven't been here a long time. But I'll save those for later. So Nehemiah was praying through all this, and that's a period of about 4 months. So he prays until the month of Nisan. But what he's doing is, you read this, you see that he's praying, he's on his knees, he's mourning, he's fasting, he's praying, he's continued to pray, seeking his God faithfully. So why is he doing this? Well, it's impossible to do the things that he felt he was led to do or wanted to do without the grace of God, without God's influence. Because remember, the cupbearer's job was simply just to drink, just to taste the wine and taste the food. And then back then in the Mideastern king's courts, you never gave the king bad news, or you didn't want to be the one given the bad news to the king. And let me get back to my place here. For example, if you were telling the king, if you told the king the bad news, then he got very disruptive and didn't like that. So maybe the bad news you're telling the king is hey, King, I hate to tell you this, but your favorite TV show, The Big Bang Theory, has been canceled, so you can't watch that. Or maybe you even tell him that the salad bar, all that's left is salad in the salad bar. Maybe unfortunately, the king was a Cowboy fan, and you had to tell the king that he lost to the Redskins in the last 30 seconds of the game. Now, you know that I live in a fantasy world if I think the Redskins will ever again beat the Cowboys. So I don't know. You just want to tell. I digress. I'll get back to this. Okay, verse 1. Let's get into the scripture. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. Now, Nehemiah was in front of the king, and he said, I had not been sad in his presence before. That was his job, to be upbeat and to take care of the job. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. So you see, the king cared for Nehemiah. He had an intimate, a friend relationship. So he's very close to the king. And then Nehemiah describes this in verse 4. And the king said to Nehemiah, said to me, what is it that you want? Okay, now watch this. Watch this. That the first thing Nehemiah did, the question came from the king, what did he do? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. So I want us to notice this, that this wasn't the first time he prayed. As you read the chapters, he's praying over and over and over again. Now here's a man who's walking intimately with his God, and he's communicating with him daily, hourly, however much it is, by speaking to him, by praying. Now, some of these prayers will be long, some of them could be short, and I just want us to understand the power of prayer, that we can pray long prayers, but we also can pray short prayers, because the moment we're close to God, we can continue asking. For example, I don't know how many times a day I've said maybe a little text type prayer. God lead me. God help me say what I want to say. God whatever. So, but he's in the presence of the king, and the king is going like, what is wrong with you, Nehemiah? What do you want? And so Nehemiah immediately goes to pray. He's praying to himself, praying to God. Then I prayed to God to heaven. I answered the king. So just remember that as we talk about prayer, there is nothing that's too big for our God to address in our prayer. There is absolutely nothing. There is nothing that our most powerful God can't react to if it's in his will. There is nothing. But also, God has a place in his heart for the smallest things that affect us. That still is in heart. There's nothing too small for his heart. So for 4 months, Nehemiah has been praying, and and so he's talking to God. Now, I'll say this: if you have a mission or a ministry or an outreach you want to do, and if prayer is not necessary for you to accomplish your vision, then your vision is too small. If you can do it without the prayer, you need to have God behind us, and the vision needs to be big enough. We'll continue talking about that through this series. So if you want something to be big, full of faith, you need the power of God to come through for it. Okay, so what do you do? How do you make a difference? First thing we do is we seek God faithfully through prayer. Number 2, define the vision clearly. Define the vision clearly. What is it that you want to do? What is it that you want help doing? What is it you want to pray to God about? Now, I hope you understand that for most of us, it's not a lack of caring about the divine burden we have on our heart. It's a matter of it's a matter of clarity. We don't explain it properly. I want to show you what I mean. If you look at, the king asked Nehemiah, he says, basically, I see you're upset. What do you want to me? And Nehemiah, this goes back to verse 5, Nehemiah says, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, and watch this, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it. Okay, that is clear. That's very clear. It's 17 words. King said, what do you want? He was right to the point. He told him. For example, maybe some of you might be like this. Maybe Nehemiah could have gone in. He could have been real shy. He could have gone in, real with his tail between his legs, saying, "King, I got to talk to you for a second. I got an Aunt Martha. She lives in Jerusalem, and I got my cousin Mickey and Danny. They're there too. And I got this letter from from Danny, and I just don't understand. I mean, there's something going on there. I don't know what it is, and I miss my family. I miss being there, and quite frankly, God, King, this job I have is dangerous. I might die. Drinking and you haven't even sent me a Hanukkah card lately. You haven't done anything. Anyway, going on and on and on, just rambling on. Now, I guess a lot of us have been guilty of doing that, just rambling on about something that you're asking for. And maybe at the end you say, well, King, I'd like to have a little bit of time, a little bit of money. He didn't do that. He was very clear. He said, this is what I want to do. So for the most of us, it's not caring that matters, it's the clarity. So what do you want me to do? What is God calling us to do? Okay, for example, so maybe you say, hey, what do you want to do? And you say, I like to help children. Okay, that's great. Okay, can you be a little more specific? Which children? The ones who don't have their basic needs met, the ones who can't read, the ones that are abused. So you straighten this out, and then you go, okay, where? Okay, is it in your hometown? Is it in your county, your state? Is it in the United States? I mean, you have to be clear. What does it need medical? You have to ask these questions. And here's what I'll say. If we can't define it, we can't do it. If we cannot define it, we cannot do it. So if God is calling us, we need to define it clearly. What do you want me to do? So Nehemiah says, send me to Judah to rebuild the walls. Okay, so it's clear. For example, let me give you some other examples. It needs to be definable. It needs to be clear. For example, you could say maybe God is leading you to have a personal conversation with every student in your class, if you're a student, about the gospel. Maybe God is leading you to have your family be debt-free by the year 2022. I don't know. Maybe it could be God's calling you to donate $100,000 to the church before you're 40 years old. By the way, Andy will be 40 in 9 months, so that's Andy's goal. Guys, maybe we have a passion, like I do, having been stuck and mired in pornography for so long, to work with the young men of the church and the men of the church to help them to confess that, to repent, and to move to next. So in a sentence, what is it God wants you to do? So, okay, first, we seek God faithfully. Second, we define the vision clearly. And third, we make plans carefully. Make plans carefully. The problem is that a goal without a plan is simply a wish. How many times have you heard someone say, I wish I could do this? I wish. Well, there's no plan. So it is just a wish. We need to be very clear with God. God is a systematic God. I mean, everything's in order. For example, there's 7 days in a week as we know it now. There's not 6 days in a week in some weeks and 7 in others. There's not 372 days in a year. It's a clear, systematic God. So we need to make our plans clearly. We make them carefully. So go back to verse 6. So then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? Now notice, Nehemiah doesn't go like, I don't know, how long does it take to build a wall? He didn't say that. He said, it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Now, we don't know how long that was. We don't know how long he said he was going to take it, when he was going to start. We do know later, you'll find out next week, in the next week, how long it took them to complete the job. So whatever it was is very specific. Verse 7, and I also said to him, Nehemiah, to the king, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. In other words, he wanted protection. Then he goes further. And this is verse 8, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and the residence that I will occupy. So what does he do? He's very specific. He asks for protection and he asks for provision. Then he says, and because the gracious hand of my God, because he sought him, was with me, the king granted my requests. Okay, what did he do? He sought God, sought the Spirit of God. God was directing his steps. God was directing him as he talked to the king. He created a plan. Now, you may say, if you think about a ministry or a project, I got a plan, but it's not a perfect plan. That's okay. That's okay. I'll tell you this, I would rather, with passion, start a plan than to overkill, trying to plan it that it's so far out that the ministry opportunity or the outreach opportunity is past. We need to get the ball rolling. I think that, to me, success is not achieving some accomplishment later on. It's making an impact now. Be clear, what's your plan? My plan is this. So what's the next thing for you? You want to start a ministry? You want to start an outreach? You want to join a ministry? What are you passionate about? Do the next thing. Go visit with those people that are running the ministry now. Learn what they're doing. See, we don't have to rebuild it. You don't have to invent the wheel from scratch. Things that you may want to be doing, the passion God has given you, they may already exist. I guess I wrote this in here for give you an example. No, I won't do that. Okay. First, we seek God faithfully. Second, we define the vision clearly. Then we make plans carefully. And number 4, we inspire people passionately. Inspire people passionately. So how do we do this? Well, I know how to do it because I've done it. I mentioned about this building. When we acquired this building, we took possession of it in February 2011, and so we had the key for one day. We took a break the next day. I came in the third day with some people on our staff, and the fire marshal and the building contractor, all this, and they said, "Hey, Pastor, you got a problem," and they're shining a light back here in the back. Well, we had the key 2 days, and the third day, when we came back in, someone had come in here that night and stripped all the copper out of this building. I mean, the building sat empty for 5 years. It's just still a mystery. How'd they know? That's another story. Because I had to call the owner of the building we're buying it from and tell him this. So that set us back. So we had to get enough power in here to get started. So by the time we got all this settled, it was already March 11 in 2011. And we had a goal, those of you who helped us, we had a goal of opening the church on Easter, which is on April 24th. Well, we had that's a pretty ambitious goal we had. Well, we figured it out, and it turned out to be 40 days, and we worked every day from, a lot of you that are in here now, from early in the morning until late nights. And it's kind of interesting. It took 40 days and 40 nights. It's kind of biblical, isn't it, how that happened? We didn't work on Sundays. But we had some naysayers. Oh, you can't do it. It won't happen, right? All you guys that were here and gals, you remember that. But Nancy and I worked hard, and we had our volunteers and our team. We had to have some professional help. But we also had Todd Varner. He's in the back here with Leslie, and Clinton Snyder built the stage. I helped. I carried the wood, didn't I? That's all. I was a gopher. Clinton Snyder and Michelle and Nancy and Pastor Andy helped. Toby and Mandy Cottrell, Eddie Lothridge and Susan, Rick Harrison. So some of those are still around. But we had the passion, a lot of prayers, a lot of blisters, a lot of late nights, a lot of redoing some stuff when guys like me messed it up and the contractors had to fix it. So, rest of the story, on April 24th, 2011, we had our first service here, and it was Easter. And we had actually 2 services. We knew there'd be a lot of people coming to see it. And so on that April 24, 2011, we welcomed 618 guests. 618, unbelievable. Amazing. Now, 4 weeks later, I'd preached it down to 120. So just so you'll know. Okay, watch what Nehemiah does. Okay, then verse 17. Then I said to them, he's talking to the king and queen, you see the trouble we're in. He's being authentic. He's being honest. He's being clear. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. So then what does he say? Then he starts calling people. He says, hey, come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And then Nehemiah says, verse 18, I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. So God is faithful. God is working. Nehemiah, and we'll learn next week and the next week about what he was doing and what can we learn from that as we create these ministries. So God's empowering us. He's opening doors. That's what he did for Nehemiah. Yeah, I like what John Wesley said. John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist Church, and he said this quote, I like it. He said, "Light yourself on fire with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn." So, someone listening today is playing with gasoline. Now, you know what I mean. You have that passion. It's burning. So what do you care about? What breaks your heart? It can be big, it can be small, it can be one person. What breaks your heart to the point that you feel somebody has to do something about it? You know, last week I gave some examples of people related to involved in High Rock that started ministries or became a part of a ministry like that. Eddie Lothridge and his wife Susan, they've been volunteering at the crisis center of Davidson County for 25 years. I mean, they had a passion for the homeless, the less fortunate. 25 years they've been doing that. Almost every week they do some. Eddie is the president of the board of directors. Andy and I have served on the board of directors, and we have Mike Moser on it now. So that's a passion. Also, Kate Barnett used to go here. They moved to Myrtle Beach. And she has a heart for single moms that fall through the cracks. As a matter of fact, her ministry is called Between the Cracks. It started out with just Kate, and then now it's grown, and she's doing this in Myrtle Beach. So that's a passion that she created. But you don't have to create these. You can join it. I mentioned Sharon Reynolds over here. Sharon has a passion for those unborn, and it breaks my heart too. How many millions of kids have been aborted. And so instead of praying about it, which we do, Sharon did something about it. She's been trained and certified by a group called CareNet, and it's nationwide. And so she's part of a group that counsels with the women, the young ladies, who are considering what their options are, quite frankly. And I got this number right. You said this week nationwide there were 5 girls. Was it 5? 6? There were 6 girls this week alone nationwide that made that decision not to abort their babies. Thank you for that. Pastor Andy, if you know Pastor Andy's his background, his testimony, he, for 16 years, starting at age 12, he was stuck in drugs. Got to the point where he was selling drugs, got to the point where he was addicted to drugs, got to the point where he was incarcerated, not just for a while, but for a long time. And so he's got this passion to help those that are in addiction, drug addiction. And so he went and got trained. He's got certification. He's been going to school. He's almost finished with that. Now he's going to go to Bible school. But it's called First Step Counseling. And he's been doing this because he had that passion. Now what we're going to do is the week 4 in this series is we're going to have, like we do for the sign-up group for Connect groups, we're going to have the lobby full of tables, and we're going to have some of these ministries I just mentioned and representatives there if you want to find out if you could be a part of that or maybe it's something for you. But also, let's not forget that these are done outside the building here. But don't forget, we have things that are needed inside the building. There's good work that needs to be done here. And so we're going to talk about all the ministries that we have. For example, Hope Humanity yesterday had 35 of you volunteering, which is great. Thank you guys so much for volunteering. The care team, there's a funeral I'm doing this afternoon. There's a family that is being fed as we talk. Food, a bunch of food is being taken over there. We visit the hospital. We do all this. Is called a care team. We have 30 people on that team right now. The High Rock students desperately need some more volunteers. The High Rock kids, the band. Anybody play the drums in here? Anybody play the drums? Nope. I tried. We need a drum player. All right. But we'll have all the ministries represented out there so we can find out what ticks in these ministries and what we can do to be a part of that. So God is putting this in our minds that we are created for a purpose. Obviously, the number one purpose is to love and glorify Him. But while we're doing that, we are to be the hands and feet of God and Jesus. And that's what I want this church to be, and it is being. But who whose responsibility is it to do that? Check this song out. So I'll ask this. What are you going to do? Let's pray.